Veće knjigu od Bogorodice odnese je caru na Kosovo. Spušta knjigu caru na koleno, sama knjiga caru besedila. Care Lazo, čestito koleno, kome ćeš se privoleti carstvu? Ili voliš carstvo nebeskome, ili voliš carstvo zemaljskome? Car volede carstvu nebeskome, a negoli carstvu zemaljskome. Pa sakroji na Kosovu crkvu. Ne vodi joj temelj od mermera, već od čiste svile i skerleta. Pa doziva srpskog patrijara i 12 velikih vladika, te pričesti i naredi vojsku. Istom kneže naredio vojsku, na Kosovo udariše Turci.
The nation at its core definition presupposes a set of criteria to organize people into a group. When the nation is elevated in importance above all else is when that concept becomes nationalism, one an exercise in classification, the other a practice of aggressive exclusion. The Serbian nation was born in the Balkans, which provided refuge for its traditions. However, Serbian nationalism is a far more complex story, one that hails mythologized heroes, battles and dynasties while vowing revenge for past betrayal. This is the Serbian epic cycle, which is rooted in its foundation myths. Every nation has its foundation myths, forming a core part of its cultural identity. Think the story of Romulus and Remus or America's first Thanksgiving. The Greeks called their northern neighbours descendants of a mythic hero named Illyrius, but their myths also change and adapt over time. One such adaptation was the political entity called Dardania, whose tradition claimed a link to the Iliad's prominent city of Dardanos. Now the Iliad of course was a pretty famous piece of historical fiction, so sometimes more than one group would lay claim to the same peoples within it. When the Romans conquered Dardania in 28 BC, they awkwardly found out that both saw Dardanus as their ancestors, and if the conquered and the conquerors were both distantly related, then what entitles Rome to its authority? To sweep this philosophical problem under the rug, the Romans decided to rename the land after the Moesians, another tribe of historical fiction. This obsession with founding myths might sound super silly, but until very recently, claims to authority were almost always based on previous authorities. Since authorities within literary myths were often taken at face value, this essentially made them tantamount to a constitution. And once you start looking, you can really find these myths anywhere. Although Rome provided most of Moesia's legal framework, it also succumbed to the same population losses as the rest of the empire due to war and famine. Rome adapted to this by settling depopulated lands with allied outsiders called foederati, and also splitting the empire into more manageable pieces, first under Diocletian and then more permanently following the reign of Constantine. Moesia would eventually transfer to the east of the two largest halves, shaping not only its future demographic changes, but also affect the development of its most long-lasting religion. We're talking of course about Orthodox Christianity, which itself was born out of adaptation. For over 4 centuries, Roman leaders appropriated what had been a melting pot of beliefs through a process called syncretization, and this was no different for the Christians. What was often thought of as a sect of Judaism had in reality many sects of its own, only some of which would be codified by Constantine at Nicaea. Although the Western Empire technically had its own emperor, whoever held that office was meant to be subordinate to the true emperor in Constantinople. The Christian tenet that there was only one true God meshed well with the idea of one true emperor, and presto, Nicene Christianity became a constitution for Rome's divine authority. The new faith was organized by the Eastern Emperor Justinian into 5 headquarters called the Holy Sees. At the time, he controlled the 2 most important in Rome and Constantinople. But as the decades passed, those handsome bearded federati kings would increasingly subsume the authority of the Western Empire into petty kingdoms of their own, pulling the See of Rome into their sphere of influence. Soon, only the Patriarch of Constantinople remained within imperial borders, which continued to exist for another 9 centuries, known as the Byzantine Empire. A theological split between the 2 sees would then emerge, as each side sought to reincorporate the other. When migrating Slavs crossed the Limes, seeking refuge from the Avars, they found ancient Illyria a messy meeting point of overlap between the 2 church hierarchies, making the choice of which to recognize a profoundly political consideration. Among these migrants were a tribe described as originating from a place called White Serbia. Emperor Heraclius is said to have granted them federati status and settled them along his frontier. The tribe's leader became known in Serbian historiography as the Unknown Archon. But the fact that the story is recorded centuries after the time of the migrations, and the colour white is used as a literary allegory for unbaptized pagans, gives us clues that the chronicle source is probably yet another foundation myth. In reality, tribal affiliations were likely to be fluid, and veneration of their princes, or knez, would only be applied retroactively centuries after their mass conversion to Eastern Christianity.
In Rome, a rebellion broke out. The belligerent emperor Marikios was swept from power, and, most important of all, the limes was abandoned. As though a dam had burst, a torrent of Slavs poured over the border, and in the years that followed, reached the furthest parts of Balkan territory. No contemporary record exists of the progress of these migrations. All that has been preserved are from much later records. The works of Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos mention the arrival of the Croats and Serbs during the rule of Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, when the first wave of Slavic migrations had already swept across the Balkans. The area settled by the migrating tribes had no uniform political organization, and tribal territory formed the basis for political groups of various sizes. Emperor Constantine called this vast principality Baptized Serbia, to distinguish it from unbaptized White Serbia to the north.
The rulers of both the Franks and a new state under the Bulgarians had started to call themselves emperors and the true successors of Rome around the same time. So the source of these mythic stories was probably born to emphasize Serbian loyalty to the ancient Byzantine divine lineage, which carried far more weight and prestige. Under this arrangement, Prince Vlastimir and his dynasty ruled a territory called Rashka in the Byzantine emperor's name. Slavic tribes traded their cool weapons for boring plows to become the serfs that worked the land. It was Vlastimir's son Mutimir that was the first prince to link his dynasty to the Unknown Archon. Hoping to gain influence on rival princes and zhupans, his descendants became prolific patrons of religious buildings like monasteries, which helped spread the myth of their family's divine lineage. Since monasteries mainly housed monks as a place to live and study, they often required funding from a patron, and becoming a patron was one of the most important ways that rulers ensured their legacy. We have a similar concept today, but instead people tend to patronize things like their favorite YouTube channels, which is a lot easier on the pocket. Hint hint. Now, this concept of the divine Roman Empire might seem all well and good, but just like that story of the Iliad, there's nothing really stopping political rivals from claiming the same authority. The Franks did this by metaphorically getting in bed with the Pope, but the Bulgarians went so far as to declare a completely separate church with its own autocephalous patriarch from which to draw their power. Although still loyal to the Orthodox Patriarch on paper, the Serbian monarchy now fell under Bulgarian jurisdiction, meaning that it adopted its Slavonic language and liturgical scripts. The fact that Byzantine leaders mainly spoke Greek made it increasingly hard for them to exercise their authority, allowing the Serbian church and monarchy to develop more independently. Unfortunately, a lot of what we know about the divine monarchy has the problem of survivorship bias. When the ancestors of the Hungarians, known as the Magyars, arrived in Europe, they came as incredibly destructive raiders, severely diminishing Bulgarian power and even driving Serbia's first dynasty to extinction. They also loved nothing more than to spend their free time destroying monasteries and their records, so what little did survive became an obsession for subsequent dynasties to emulate. When the Byzantines reconquered the Balkans and abolished Bulgaria's autocephaly, a minor dynasty of Duklia were the first to emulate it successfully, with a little help from the example of the Franks and their descendants in the Holy Roman Empire. Since 1054, the relationship between the Pope and the Patriarch devolved into complete schism, leading to the creation of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Eager to exploit this division for his own gain, Mihailo of House Voislav had asked the Catholic Pope to elevate his state to a kingdom, and the Byzantines responded by recognizing his nephew Vukan as Grand Prince in Rashka, which was just their version of a king. For a while, there were two competing Serbian monarchies until the Duklians were defeated, but the rivalry between the two churches was only just beginning. Following the schism, Pope Gregory significantly increased the power and influence of the Catholic Church. Catholic states like Hungarians, Venetians, and Normans, who thought the Pope was pretty dope, began undermining the Byzantines by smuggling goods through Serbia, creating a very wealthy and thus very loyal aristocracy. But perhaps more infamously is how the rivalry escalated during the Crusades. In an act of desperation, the Byzantines had called out to the Pope for aid against the Seljuk Turks. Unfortunately, what they got was a rowdy mob from those aforementioned Catholic states, who used the religious divide to justify establishing new states on their borders. By the Fourth Crusade, even Constantinople itself was sacked and Byzantium's heartland temporarily seized. The weakening of Byzantium allowed the Vukanovich dynasty to assert more autonomy, carefully playing the two sides to expand its own wealth and territory. This culminated in the rise of Stefan Nemanja, who became the progenitor of Serbia's most important royal family. By this point, the obsession with the previous divine authorities had been irreversibly entrenched into a pseudo-lineage called the Serbian epic cycle. As part of that tradition, Stefan Nemanja's long reign is itself steeped with mythic, literary, and religious symbolism. Legend has it that the ever-unsatisfied prince felt a higher calling in the twilight years of his life and abdicated the throne to join his son as a monk. The two adopted monastic names, Simeon and Sava, and are venerated as saints to this day. Exactly what happens next is the subject of some debate, but most sources agree that Saint Sava abandoned his monastic vows and declared the Serbian church autocephalous. He then became the church's first archbishop and crowned his brother Stefan king, creating what became the Serbian Sacred Dynasty. But is the story true? Well, literary critics are quick to point out that all this conveniently took place while Sava's brothers were fighting a war of succession and the Byzantine authorities were incapacitated, and I probably don't have to point out the many similarities to the Bulgarian church's history. Papal records contradict almost the entire story and claim it was them who had given Stefan his crown. If so, Orthodox historians probably left this part out because they found it super embarrassing. But even critics have to admit that the intertwining of state and church authority into a single family provides a neat conclusion to this phase of the Serbian epic cycle. It formed Serbia's most enduring constitution. 10 kings of the dynasty would rule Serbia for over a century, funding the construction of monasteries where they would eventually be buried. Each one became a shrine to its patron around which personality cults would form. The success of the Serbian kingdom is largely laid at the feet of the Sacred Dynasty kings, but we also have to acknowledge the overlooked role played by Hungary. By creating the office of junior king as a vassal to the Hungarian crown, the nobility could influence politics by simply supporting the junior king, instead of risking treason or rebellion, which carries the risk of losing your head. This set a precedent that any member of the Sacred Dynasty could become king by pleasing the right people. Perhaps the most interesting example of which was how Stefan Juroš Dechansky did so by utilizing a now famous founding myth of his own. The prince claimed that he had been imprisoned and blinded in Constantinople on the orders of his father, but soon his sight was miraculously restored. As a sign of divine blessing, this won him enough support from the nobility to overthrow his family rivals, turn on his former captors and expand his holdings at their expense, establishing enormous new capital cities in what is now Kosovo. Taking Byzantine territory was a major turning point in the trajectory the Sacred Dynasty would take. Having seen Constantinople had never fully recovered from the Crusade, Dechansky propagated the idea that it was his family's destiny to succeed the Roman Empire, which should honestly just be a drinking game by this point. The dream of taking the Roman throne was passed down to Stefan Dušan, who dramatically escalated the conquests. With so much Roman territory now under his control, he followed the Bulgarians in declaring his church a patriarchate, and with great pomp and ceremony, laid down his own claim to imperial succession.
In late 1345, after conquering the city of Ceres and reaching an agreement with representatives from Mount Athos, who pledged to recognize him as the ruler and mentioned him during the liturgy following the Byzantine emperor, Dušan proclaimed himself emperor. The period of these conquests coincided with certain domestic events which portrayed Dušan as a grand emperor, one in the line that started with Constantine the Great. In particular, there was the promulgation of the Zakonik, Dušan's Code, which includes an introduction describing his ascent to the imperial throne as an expression of divine grace. A charter issued by John Paleologos dated 1350 mentions Dušan as His Highness, the Emperor of Serbia, and kind uncle Kir Stefan.
You'd be forgiven for thinking Serbia was on an unstoppable trajectory, but just as epic cycles have their low point, so too was this great empire about to collapse under the weight of its own hubris. Having made a minor comeback following the Fourth Crusade, Byzantine commanders had increasingly hired Turkish mercenaries to deal with Serb expansion, and soon these Turks wielded enough power to wage a conquest of their own. In truth, Dušan's empire was nowhere near as united as the annals would have us believe, and following his death, differences in law and tradition caused fragmentation under his son's rule. These divisions favoured the Muslim Turks of the Ottoman dynasty, allowing them to easily defeat junior King Vukašin in 1371. Just 2 months later, Dušan II died without an heir, leaving the Sacred Dynasty in jeopardy of falling to the Muslim hordes perched at their doorstep. Prince Lazar of Great Morava thought otherwise. Through his marriage into the Sacred Dynasty, the prince had become one of the most powerful nobles in Serbia, and hoped that a resounding defeat of the Turkish Sultan Murad would allow him to install his own son as emperor. It was not a bad plan. In fact, it was almost exactly what the junior king had tried to do. The problem was that Vukašin was not a member of the Sacred Dynasty, and both clergy and nobility had seen this as to blame for his resounding defeat. To win, Prince Lazar would need not only military strength, but symbolic Nemanjić power as well. So he enlisted the help of his son-in-law Vuk Branković and King Tvrko of Bosnia, both of whom were distant cousins of the royal family. Where and when they would meet Murad was also decided in advance. Kosovo Field, the hallowed ground near Dušan's capital, on the holy Vidovdan festival of the Orthodox Christian calendar. Surely now they would regain divine favour, expel the Sultan's horde of Turks out of Christendom, and reunite the Serbian Empire. Sources conflict as to exactly what happened, but neither Prince Lazar nor Sultan Murad survived the day's end. Rumours circulated that the prince must have been betrayed and that the Sultan was assassinated by a lone Serbian hero. Both were hailed as martyrs to church, empire, and sacred dynasty, inspiring art, folk songs, and poetry so popular they would even be recited in church. Vuk Branković was among the few who escaped the battle with his life, and it is in these early poems we get the first hints that he may have betrayed the prince. It's important to remember that most of these records are drenched in literary fabrications to bring much needed consolation, a practice not uncommon to chronicles and poetry, but history and historicity are not always the same. To reconcile the fall of God's chosen dynasty, defeat was instead reframed as a sacrifice of biblical proportions, echoing Christian apocalyptic literature to birth a Kosovo myth that would have incredible staying power in the epic cycle.
As time passed, the leitmotif of treason emerged on the Christian side, becoming focused and remaining on Vuk Branković. In the first decades of the following battle, the theme emerged of the slandered knight who went to the Turkish camp to slay Sultan Murad. An entire collection of epic poetry was created, such as the one that opened this video, containing many picturesque details very far from reality. The general view of the battle and its consequences was also far from reality. The Battle of Kosovo was not a crusade, nor was it the defense of Christianity. The idea that the fall of the Serbian Empire took place at the Battle of Kosovo is fundamentally wrong, because the state continued to exist for a further 7 decades. And yet, of all Serbian historical events, Kosovo became the most popular episode, deeply engraved in the national consciousness. According to folklore traditions, it set off migrations and ruptured the development of clans and families, and served as an inspiration for sacrifices up to the 20th century.
Almost all of subsequent Serbian cultural development was cultivated by the literary tropes of the Kosovo mythic cycle. It begins with martyrdom. Prince Lazar, or one of the heroes, is killed in battle. A traitor is then revealed, but we return our focus back to the glory the martyr will gain in heaven. Only then does it end with a promise of the same glory for the future Serbs, couched in the language of treachery, subversion, betrayal, and revenge. By the time the Ottomans began settling Albanian and Slavic allies in war-torn Kosovo, provided they convert to Islam, these polemics soon came to be associated with the newcomers. And as Serbian refugees began fleeing to the north and west, they took their fear and distrust with them. When it looked as though the Ottoman Sultan would himself be the next successor of Rome, drink, the prince's son, Stefan Lazarevich, was pressed into their service before eventually turning against them. In return for allyship, the incredibly diminished Byzantine Empire bestowed on him the prestigious title despot. But when this was inherited by his nephew, Juraj Branković, the true cost of resisting the Turks became all too clear. The treasury was depleted. Landowners were fleeing towards Bosnia and Hungary, taking with them their serfs as refugees in those lands. In 1453, the Ottomans would snuff out Serbia's source of legitimacy for good when their cannons broke through the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines were gone. In their place, the Ottoman Empire. Despite inflicting major losses on the Turks the following year, the last Serbian holdouts were eventually taken as well, and became known as Smederevo. If we are to trace the roots of Serbian nationalism to Kosovo, it is only after the fall of the despotate in 1459 where those connections begin to be made. The last traces of the Branković family were driven extinct, leaving few barriers for an Ottoman takeover. Thus, what remained of the Serbian state was the church, which was confronted by a great theological crisis, made worse when the Ottomans forbade the election of new patriarchs. The church begins to describe the Serbian people like a non-temporal nation, a heavenly Serbia that was martyred by the Turks, just as Prince Lazar had been a century earlier. It is from this heavenly kingdom that earthly Serbia is foretold to be reborn, to bring justice for Kosovo and vengeance against the Turks. These ideas had a profound impact on the Serbian psyche and continue to influence relations between Serbia and Turkey today. While the Ottomans aren't solely responsible for creating nationalism in the Balkans, they did give it an enemy to unite around. The modern Turkish state has done a poor job of distancing itself from its forebears. It still occupies the core of the Ottoman state and flies the Ottoman flag. So even though the empire technically no longer exists, relations between it and all of its former Balkan subjects have never fully improved. Greece, for example, has been in a state of frozen conflict with Turkey ever since a war in the 20th century stoked a dramatic rise in ethno-nationalism. This is covered in an episode of Modern Conflicts by my creative friends over at Real Life Law. Nationalism was also at the heart of the more recent Yugoslav wars, which can trace a lot of its roots to the divisions sown in the Ottoman period. The Yugoslav wars are among the most brutal examples of the horrors that ethnic violence can unleash, and for that reason the home of Modern Conflicts is Nebula, where a show like it isn't at risk of demonetization like it would be here on YouTube. Now, if you don't already know, Nebula is an independent streaming service of thoughtful content that Suibhne partly owns. We not only pool our resources together to fund original content like Modern Conflicts, but also pay our creators to promote that content like I'm doing right now, meaning that this very section isn't in the Nebula version of this video. In fact, all Nebula is ad and sponsor free. Our creators have also agreed to upload our videos to Nebula before YouTube, which you can find on the Nebula First tab, or with this helpful icon below the thumbnail. We also host bonus content and companion videos exclusively under Nebula Plus, shown with this icon. Nebula subscribers were even watching this video a month ago, so why wait longer than you have to for future Suibhne content? Signing up for Nebula not only supports me, but all of these creators too, as we build a prestige collection of content you won't find anywhere else. High-budget game shows, news, documentaries, history, and so much more. To get real for a second, the creator economy is incredibly precarious, and we're often rewarded for our time and hard work with low engagement and diminishing returns. Channels like mine will always struggle to compete with larger or more established brands. So Nebula helps provide that stability that we need while also remaining committed to maintaining it at a reasonable price. Nebula costs just $6 a month. But if you sign up using my link or by scanning the QR code on your screen, you can get a massive 40% off, coming out at $36 on a yearly plan or just $3 a month. If you don't want a recurring subscription, you can also choose to make a one-time purchase of $300 for our incredibly popular lifetime plan. Just pay once and get access to all of Nebula forever. It really is as simple as that. If you already have a Nebula subscription and still want to help out the channel, you can also gift one to somebody else by following the link below for the same discounted rate. And at the risk of sounding ridiculous, I also have to say, but wait, there's more. Because along with all the benefits, you'll also get to give out week-long guest passes to whoever you like so they can enjoy unrestricted access to Nebula without even having to enter any payment information at all. Just type in their email and they can start watching, no strings attached. We really care about what we're making over at Nebula, so if you really want to support us here at Suibhne, sign up to Nebula today to start watching some truly prestige content. With the royal half of the Sacred Dynasty extinct, what remained of the Serbian Church felt duty-bound to keep its memory alive. But with its property confiscated or desecrated by Turkish soldiers, how did the Church itself escape the same fate? The answer actually lies in the Ottoman Empire's very own policies. Church leaders would be allowed to purchase back their property from the state by going into enormous debt. But borrowing from foreign banks was outlawed, so instead the debts were transferred to Jewish creditors who acted as the perfect middlemen between Muslims and Christians. This allowed thousands of Sephardic Jews to settle in the Balkans following their expulsion from Spain.
The greatest novelty imposed by the Ottomans was the ban on gold and silver exports. Financiers and creditors disappeared, and the Turkish authorities demanded the introduction of the saraf, moneylenders. Moneylenders were found among the Jewish people who had been driven out of Spain in the late 15th century and arrived in the Ottoman Empire in large numbers. The religious activity of the once wealthy church was tolerated, but church buildings were seized immediately after the capture of towns and cities and were adapted to the needs of the Muslim conquerors. The church suffered great material losses. Monks were granted priority in the purchase of confiscated property. However, this required large sums of money that had to be borrowed, and the church struggled for decades to repay its debts. Monasteries and churches were forced to change their financial structure completely. This was achieved by the diligent collection of church taxes and charity, and powerful and wealthy patrons were sought among the remaining Christian nobility in Wallachia, Moldavia, and increasingly in Russia.
What this did was give the church a pulse. Within just one generation, the church was transformed into an insular and self-obsessed institution, lamenting the loss of its perceived former glory. It poured what thin resources it had into hymns, poetry, and upkeep, embracing asceticism and the sacred dynasty cults. Parishioners of every class were encouraged to recite Kosovo poems to their children, passing down an intergenerational trauma. The wealthy spent a fortune creating detailed family lineages to link themselves to the sacred dynasty. Some of the most successful being the mountain clans of Crna Gora, who managed to resist the Turks from the highlands of what eventually became Montenegro. But it was the policy of kidnapping Serbian children as slaves that would ironically have the greatest effect. Ottoman slaves actually formed a big chunk of their bureaucracy, allowing many to rise to positions of wealth and power. And though they were expected to convert to Islam, many of these children remembered their Orthodox roots thanks to their indoctrination. One such example was Sukolo Mehmet Pasha, who as Grand Vizier used his power to restore the Serbian Patriarchate under the Sultan's purview, and even renegotiate the price of church debts. Jewish bankers also used connections with their kin abroad to make contact with Russian benefactors, who then helped pay off those loans. You may remember that the Russians began to see themselves as the Third Rome following the Byzantine collapse. Drink! So, through religious patronage, they took on a deep spiritual interest in the cult of the Sacred Dynasty and fostered close ties to the Serbs. The final piece of the puzzle would be the Serbs in diaspora. They found themselves fleeing yet again as Hungary fell to the Ottomans, becoming refugees in the domains of the Holy Roman Empire held by the Austrian Habsburgs. The Austrians offered them a deal: settle along the borders and fight the Ottomans. In exchange, they could continue being Orthodox Christians and gain freedom from feudal obligations. This was the inception of the military frontiers, a vast fortified line at the focal point in the Ottoman-Habsburg Wars.
Being in a border area created a lot of insecurity for the local population. To incentivize people at the very bottom of the military hierarchy to stay, King Ferdinand issued his first charter about the Uskoks, Serbian term meaning escapees, to refer to the escapees from the Ottoman lands, according to which escapees were granted land as hereditary fiefs in exchange for military service. Unlike other people in the civilian area, these were free men, organizing themselves under their elected captains called the voivode. Having the right to maintain their religion and religious institutions officially recognized, the Orthodox inhabitants of the military colony were seen as schismatics. The migration from Serbian lands into the military colony is what reinforced the Serbian component of the military colony. In the Banal regiments, they constituted more than half of the population. Other Christian Orthodox and Catholics also fled Bosnia, Dalmatia, and Central Europe to become frontier guards.
This also royally pissed off the Hungarians. Quite literally, the emperor himself was just giving away their former lands. The Habsburgs also helped fund Serbian rebels across the border known as Hajduks, important guerrilla warriors that would later go on to inspire much of the folklore of the Serbian Renaissance. Every time the Ottomans cracked down on them, the ranks of the frontiers would only grow. Most famously, the Ottoman-appointed Serbian Patriarch himself led a great migration of Serbian families across the border, setting up shop with a new headquarters in Karlovci. With time, it also became the center of secular life for the Hungarian Serbs, giving them a space to freely discuss the ideas of the Enlightenment and also throw awesome parties. Now, if you're wondering why the Habsburgs would afford the Serbs so many privileges, using my powers of reading stuff in a book, I can tell you a lot of it came down to religious chauvinism and geopolitics. The three largest Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim powers were naturally competing for influence over the land between them, each of whom also claimed to be the legal successor of Rome. Drink. By keeping the Serbs in their good graces, the emperor countered the influence of the other two while also having an ally deep within Hungarian territory for when they decided to rebel themselves. If the Serbs didn't already know they were being used as a pawn, they certainly found out when the Austrians captured Smederevo in 1718. Instead of restoring the Sacred Dynasty, the emperor declared himself King of Serbia, and then humiliated the Serbs by abandoning the territory just 2 decades later. The Austrians were of course playing some pretty serious 4D chess, since although they felt betrayed, the Serbs had no other choice than to flee back north as the Ottomans burned their villages. Realizing the hopelessness of their situation, they resorted to channel their energy into the empire's legal mechanisms instead. They played politics, lobbying against the Hungarians and fighting any imperial edict that might threaten their privileges. Inspired by the Enlightenment, they hoped to eventually codify those privileges into a constitution akin to the Sacred Dynasty. But the Enlightenment was no longer limited to the Serbian elite. Imperial education policies began to raise the literacy rate, and the average Serb found themselves drawing on centuries of traditions, myths, and folklore for publication, resulting in the birth of Serbian nationalism. The world around them was also being affected by these changes. New theological and political philosophies were putting to question everything from the divine right of kings to the legitimacy of religious orthodoxy. In answer to these questions, Serbian intellectuals embraced a new idea, one that would see the Serbs not as an isolated nation, but merely part of a greater whole. A South Slavic nation, along with Croats and Slovenes, separated only by religion and politics. At the time, it was called the Illyrian movement, deliberately evoking an identity from antiquity by harkening back to the ancient name of their homeland. But we know it today as Yugoslavism, a dream of a South Slavic brotherhood that could unite and overthrow the shackles of both Austrian and Ottoman imperialism. In part 2, we're going to discuss how Serbian nationalists helped make this dream a reality, but far more importantly, how that same Serbian nationalism would in turn destroy it from the inside. If you can't wait for part 2, you're in luck because I already have more than 10 hours of bonus content on Serbia over on my second channel. The Rabbit Hole podcast goes live every Friday, so be sure to subscribe and join us if you'd like to hear me ramble on about these topics even more. I'd like to give a massive shout out to Ravignon, Archaia Historia, and Balkan Odyssey for their help with the script, as well as the first new member of the Sweeney team, Phoebe. The artwork done by these incredibly talented artists also really helped bring this video to life and can be downloaded in HD on Patreon or channel memberships of any tier. I also want to thank these creators for contributing their wonderful voice work, all of whom have terrific channels of their own linked in the description. If you'd like to support the show, become a YouTube member or patron. You'll get to see the next video early and also get your name in the credits just like everyone you see on screen now. Thank you to my King tier supporters, Juan Bennett, Dwayne S., Harry R., Eric Price, Eric Zinn, Chef Frank, and Michael Shaw. Your generous support keeps the channel going and I could not be more grateful. Remember to leave a sacrifice to the almighty algorithm in the form of the customary like, subscribe, and share trifecta to keep its wrath at bay. If you're one of those special viewers who watches the credits till the end, comment below your favorite successor to the Roman Empire and why, and I'll select the best to be featured in the next episode. Until next time.